Pro wrestling can be an incredibly cynical hobby, especially for the fan who would prefer to no longer give attention to the prevailing brand. It could be for moral reasons or even difference of taste, and making that choice means choosing potential obscurity, irrelevance. But that's the price that must be paid for being forever in the shadow of the number one wrestling promotion. But wrestling, at its purest, has always been about good triumphing over evil. And the man they call Sting has been the lighthouse, always leading us back to his light. Is there anything more unironically cool than that? As fans, we know it's not real, and yet we continue to believe. Here's the brutal truth. Wrestling is a con business. And in the post-kayfabe era we now live in, it has become harder and harder to convince non-fans, or should I say non-believers, what it is that we love about it. It's a mystery to us often. Wrestling is like Christianity in this sense. We're perverts and freaks who should know better, and yet we can't help but continue to participate in the spectacle. Christianity and pro wrestling are paradoxes of violence and romance. But this video ain't gonna get traction. Talking about Christianity? Jesus Christ. Anyway, it would be impossible to sum up Sting's legendary career in a 20-minute video, but that is precisely the appeal of Sting. It's not one match or feud or promo we remember, but his quiet leadership and stubbornness to remain good, despite a world that has tried convincing us how futile it is to try to be good. As Tony Schiavone said after his final match, quote, "Sting was a better man than a pro wrestler, and there's not a lot of people you can say that about," end quote. We have to feel good before we have any chance of doing good. And wrestlers are willing to risk their spiritual and physical selves for our sadistic pleasure. Sting isn't my favorite wrestler. He's probably not even in my top 10 if I'm being honest. He wasn't the greatest worker like his rival turned friend Ric Flair, nor was he the greatest talker, which is an accolade more reserved for someone like CM Punk or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. But this is what makes him exciting. No one has ever had a bad thing to say about Sting, which in the oftentimes predatory business of professional wrestling is about as miraculous as it gets. How the hell can a 64-year-old white dude from California still exude cool and charisma in the tenuous and cancel-rated culture of 2024? He is the exception to the rule that a wrestler must entertain with his words. To celebrate Sting is to celebrate not just what's worth remembering about pro wrestling, but maybe even what it could become. Wrestling gets a bad rap for an endless number of jaded reasons you can find online, but Sting's final match is his reminder to us to be proud of the people and things you love. In an interview with Colette Aaron for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Sting describes himself and the wrestlers of pre-NWO WCW as second-class citizens. Vince McMahon's monopoly of American wrestling in the 1980s ensured Hulkamania, and sports entertainment became the most popular and accepted of wrestling's buzzwords or virtues, whatever you want to call it, moving forward. This was when American values like individualism began to triumph over the collective will of the people. And it is no surprise that the comparison remains apt today, as the monolithic WWE has globalized to the point of convincing the vast majority of fans that anything outside of WWE's sphere is illegitimate and not worth your time. AEW is only 5 years old as a wrestling promotion, and instead of being seen as a celebration of what an alternative could be, AEW continually gets mocked for being either too amateurish or featuring workers who don't follow the same hegemonic and heteronormative presentation WWE thrives on. Don't get me wrong, AEW still unconsciously models itself after WWE, but that's unfortunately the result of decades of unquestioned dominance. Sting was entrusted with the unenviable task of being the guy to follow Ric Flair out of the 80s and into the 90s in WCW, a company whose management was hell-bent on emulating the very things WWE was doing as top dog then. He was a white meat babyface, something that has always been more difficult to pull off than being a heel. Lashing out and being hypocritical is easy, but to remain loyal and consistent, that earns respect. Sting continued to be good in an era of ironic anti-heroes, and it is no accident that Sting's final match takes place in the Greensboro Coliseum, the same venue he took NWA champion Ric Flair the distance in a 45-minute draw 35 years ago, the night he became a star. Unfortunately, Sting's white meat babyface status came with a curse: naivete. He was always getting stabbed in the back by his friends, leading to jokes and memes about his stupidity, but Sting was our Hulkster. A big guy with bulging muscles, but with earnestness that wasn't exposed as disingenuous over time, and a guy who could move with explosiveness and conviction. Sting was one of the first heavyweights to do drop kicks and moves off the top rope, and we proudly ate up every second as second-class fans. Hogan may have captivated the WWE universe with his theatrics and empty rhetoric, but Sting's fealty to the underdog made him more relatable to us freaks. He was forever loyal to the number 2 wrestling promotion in America, whether that be WCW in the 80s and early 90s, TNA in the 2000s, or now AEW. Once Hogan jumped ship to WCW in the mid-90s, the company transitioned from camp to a more reality-based approach. Sting himself transitioned from the earnest and lively babyface to sad boy Crow Sting. He stood silently in the rafters, armed with his black bat, contemplating the narcissistic and cancerous growth of the NWO, a faction made up of ex-WWE guys on top of the food chain. WCW became so culturally relevant that WWE was, for a brief moment, on the verge of going out of business. Creative head of WCW, Eric Bischoff, decided to wait 18 months to have Sting wrestle, one of his better ideas. And when he did, he wrestled the biggest babyface of the 80s turned biggest heel of the 90s, Hollywood Hogan. The biggest heel in wrestling, the former WWE guy, was going against the biggest babyface in the history of WCW. It was one of the most anticipated matches of all time. And the match sucked. Sting was distracted by marital problems and a painkiller addiction like most of his co-workers at the time. Hogan's knees were shot, as was any desire to put on entertaining matches. That was up to the cruiserweights, who carried most of WCW's undercard so Hogan could slum it in main events. In this time of confusion and pain, Sting quit opium cold turkey and found God in Christianity. By 2001, after a cavalcade of poor management decisions, cable executives being ashamed of pro wrestling and money being spent in all the wrong places, Vince McMahon was finally able to purchase WCW and finally complete his monopoly on American wrestling. Fans who felt burned by WWE's banality, not to mention their insistence on dictating to us which performers to cheer and boo for, had very few options to turn to. A new foundation had to be built. And this is where I'd like to take a moment, if you'll allow me, to talk about another woefully obscure topic in 2024. The 19th century German madman Frederich Nietszche had a theory that with the death of God, humanity had to invent new games to play, now that we were left with no meaning in our lives. The simulated art of pro wrestling became one such game. An unholy trinity of sports, performance art, and advertising. The death of God isn't a cause for celebration. It is the foundation of nihilism, which is the depressing belief that precisely nothing about what we do in our life matters. But further down the nihilistic abyss, we eventually fall into absurdism. And there is nothing more absurd or unlikely than Sting. I say that with love. A product of the wrestling business, known for being viciously competitive and backstabbing, and yet paradoxically universally loved by both his peers, co-workers, and fans alike in an unprecedented moment of unity. Sting is actually quite a humble, ordinary man in pro wrestling. But it was even more absurd, but also pretty fucking awesome when Sting debuted for AEW to an empty arena during the first year of the pandemic. He was now in his 60s, and 5 years removed from nearly being paralyzed in his final match, which was a WWE match. Was he for real? No way he was gonna actually wrestle. But he started to have matches, and smartly teamed with AEW's top risk taker, Darby Allin. Darby Allin wrestles every match as if it is his last. Darby is a bump machine. That is his gift to the fans. With each new and creative bump, greater and more dangerous than the last, he redeems himself to the fans still resentful of his success. This is the man CM Punk chose to be his first opponent in AEW. This is the man Sting chose to finish his career with. How far we've come from Jim Hellwig and Lawrence Full, two muscle-bound bros who used to look down at the sacred art of pro wrestling. The former for thinking he deserved his spot before he earned it, and the latter for thinking he was too smart for it. Now Warrior is dead, and Luger has transformed his life, now confined to a wheelchair. He too has found God, and we don't think any less of him for doing so. In fact, we respect him more than ever. Pro wrestling was a game created from out of the abyss of a godless world, and yet wrestling can only work through the belief of the fans. Wrestling fans are like the person who buys organic fruit believing they are collectively giving meaning to something that deep down they all know is bullshit. This is what philosopher Slavoj Zizek calls fetishistic disavowal, or in other words, we give meaning to our belief, something that shouldn't make sense. Like the scientist who puts a horseshoe outside of his home because he was told that even if he doesn't believe in it, it still works. And it is rather fitting that Sting's final match happens at a time when AEW is enduring a trying time of endless criticism, one in which they are viewed as woefully irrelevant next to WWE, who have gained an upsurge of popularity since the 120-year-old Vince McMahon stepped down as creative head of the company. Sting and Darby Allin's opponents are Christians themselves, the Young Bucks. They have become scapegoats for the shift in perspective in AEW thanks in large part to the tumultuous non-feud between the Elite and CM Punk. The hope was that CM Punk and the Elite would be able to get along. I won't lie, I watched CM Punk's AEW debut way more times than is healthy to count, and I am still processing the trauma of not only his brawl-out tirade, not only his excommunication from AEW, but his return to WWE, something I and many other fans thought unfathomable. The guy was such an integral part of AEW that he got his own show on Saturday nights, and this is where I have to put the disclaimer that I fall into the camp of AEW fans who are left rather cold by a lot of the Bucks' output in the ring. Fans like me have to remain quiet about why this is, mostly because Julian has made a career out of podcasting by hate-watching their matches. Not to mention his obsession with Kenny Omega, where he'll casually toss out homophobic remarks and aggressively judge nerd culture, from video games to anime. You think this type of cringe content wouldn't work in 2024, but his YouTube channel is neck and neck with the Young Bucks being the Elite. There were the usual jokes and burials when the Young Bucks were chosen as Sting and Darby's final opponents, and I admit I was one of them. How wrong we all were. Because now that we've seen the match, there could have been no other choice. The Bucks have finally leaned into the thing AEW fans have been begging them for. They flaunt their executive authority in front of both workers and fans alike. They now go by their Christian names, Nicholas and Matthew, proudly wearing the Catholic cross. Their characters have been seduced by evil, and is evil not the good that believes itself to be absolutely good? Pro wrestling thrives on sincerity when it is done in earnest. Who knew? As much as wrestling has tried to fixate on ironic detachment, the reality is that pro wrestling remains most emotionally resounding when we want to cheer for people who do cool and noble things, and we want to boo people who do cowardly and above all hypocritical things. It's impossible now not to see how this was all so necessary for Sting's final match. You could imagine this being an alternative reality where this could have been CM Punk feuding with the Bucks. When CM Punk went off on the Elite, it confirmed from people who already disliked them that they weren't such the virtuous people they claimed to be. Men who bragged about starting a revolution, despite that revolution only being possible thanks to a billionaire wrestling fan's checkbook. The Bucks initially chose to ignore the bad publicity, justified or not, by wrestling as babyfaces, and it didn't resonate with the crowd, who treated them with the worst kind of crowd reaction: quiet indifference. So the Bucks were left with no choice but to become the heels they were destined to become. waiting for the perfect opportunity to pounce on vulnerable champions, pummeling the Icon's sons who got to see their father finally win AEW gold, baptizing themselves in the blood of the new champions and wearing it as a badge of honor in pure white business suits, the physical embodiment of hypocrisy. Sting in AEW has the freedom to do the very destructive and foolish act of going through tables and glass precisely to show by his example how you could live your life. If there is a message to his career, it is to live as freely as you can. The message obviously isn't to go through tables at the age of 64, but to commit yourself to one project, to one life. This is the paradox of freedom, that once you've chosen to do something, you foreclose the possibility to do other things. Being a wrestling fan is an act of freedom. It is to choose potential ridicule, especially if you've planted your flag for a company that doesn't have 40 years of revisionist history working against it. To watch wrestling, especially as an AEW fan or Ring of Honor fan in 2024 TNA, what are our options here? It is to invite the possibility of ridicule. It is to knowingly watch, support, and love something that is shamed by people who swear loyalty to, quite honestly, a trendier brand. We react by calling them drones, but we can also choose not to do anything for them. Belief doesn't come easy, which is why we admire Sting. We love his naivete, his courage, and his loyalty. Part of belief as fans is accepting we can't help but want to see pain, suffering, and shock. We love to hate the Young Bucks because they had the audacity to play slimy hypocrites, and guess what? They look like they're having the time of their lives doing so. We have to feel good before we can do good. Our ideologies thrive on negative energy and emotion. Pro wrestling thrives on negative energy and emotion because it is thrilling and stimulating, and it is sold back to us as something we enjoy, shamefully or not, and we all participate so we could do it over again the next week because the wrestling business has no off-season. I could give a recap of all the moves done in the match, but I think we've gotten too lost in the analytical weeds of what makes a wrestling match great. Pro wrestling, to me, has always been about more than the moves, and this is a balance AEW has struggled to maintain. It is only right that the rules are completely thrown out the moment the bell rings. It's a tornado tag anyways, which means no disqualification. But aside from the most jaded of AEW watchers saying this is one of the best matches AEW has ever done and is already a shoo-in for match of the year, if that wasn't enough for you, we even get Excalibur audibly saying, "Oh shit," when Darby topes through the ropes like a bleached torpedo onto the Jacksons. Sting wrestles in a shirt. He knows he's 64, but he's wise enough to understand that to have had one singles match during his AEW run was to invite the temptation of cynical fans to hyperfixate on the flaws. Darby Allin is the ideal complement, able to maintain the illusion through his incredible risks. Then we see Sting take risks, and we all hold our breath in disbelief that a 64-year-old legend can not only sustain this type of damage, but absorb it. Not many wrestlers have earned the right to no-sell, but Sting's loyalty to the second class who remain loyal to him buy into it because he is one of us. With the exception of Sting's brief tenure in WWE, none of these guys have worked for WWE. I'd be shocked if the company saw any value in Darby Allin, a man who weighs 175 pounds, wrestles in tight denim shorts and stockings, and takes too many uncalculated risks to justify the headache. Every man here is operating at the highest level a pro wrestler can. A lot of times AEW gets it wrong with the crowd. They're certainly not perfect. The Bucks might want to believe that they are the lambs led to the slaughter, but they are not the underdogs anymore. And they've embraced the lion. They're virtuous, hypocritical dickheads who will do anything for a reaction, and God bless them for it. And Sting knows he's not immortal. He admits that he's still terrified every time he goes out to perform, but he does it for the collective will of the faithful, who will not be told what type of wrestling they should cheer for. Pro wrestling is a negation. As fans, we cannot understand the toll it takes on one's mental and physical health, but we do share in the courage of being seen as second class and wearing it as a badge of honor anyways. Is this video cringe? Absolutely. Do I believe every word I've said? Okay, maybe about 95%. The Christian apologist G.K. Chesterton explained it as such, quote, "He can only get away from death by continually stepping within an inch of it. A soldier surrounded by enemies, if he is to cut his way out, needs to combine a strong desire for living with a strange carelessness about dying. He must not merely cling to life, for then he will be a coward and will not escape. He must not merely wait for death, for then he will be a suicide and will not escape. He must seek his life in a spirit of furious indifference to it. He must desire life like water and yet drink death like wine." End quote. The con business of professional wrestling implies a complicity between fan and wrestler. The sacred bond of kayfabe is maintained despite the awareness that this is all predetermined. I said at the beginning that being a wrestling fan is like being a Christian, and is it really any surprise that 3 out of the 4 men in Sting's final match are Christian? And we're all the lucky vampires who get to devour the trauma and enjoy the spectacle. So let me end on the moment when Jesus, yeah, I'm going there, died on the cross. It isn't that he died to save us, but in the moment before death, after enduring all humiliation and suffering, he looks up and asks, "Father, why have you abandoned me?" And it is in this moment that the Father no longer believes in himself. In other words, God is not the Almighty who thinks he knows what's best for us, but rather an impotent and incompetent undead body here on earth. And only then does the revolutionary message become clear. It isn't that the divine answer lie unknowingly in the sky, eternally out of reach and unattainable. It is rather that the divine has made its way down to earth in the love of the community of the faithful.
This gotta be near.
Wrestling fans certainly believe despite it all, and we will make ourselves broke so that it may continue to grow. We've been shamed by Daddy, whom in his insecurity and paranoia created an unstable and ethically dubious ambitious empire we can choose to not participate in. Call me a tribalist if you wish. I love all types of pro wrestling. In our love, we choose to have the courage to be hopeless, and we enjoy doing so. Thank you, Sting. And thanks for everyone who watched. See you next time.